Welcome to the Baunfire. I am Morgan, aka Baun. I will be your host for this episode, and this is a podcast about video game news, reviews, rumors, and speculation. This week, I'll be covering a little bit more about the Insomniac hacks. We'll be talking about Bobby Kotick getting the F out, and a video I made that made a bunch of people really mad, and much more. A few things before we get started. On YouTube, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment down below to help me out. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform, and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes. A special thank you to all of the patrons and YouTube members, including Hassan, YouTube's Neuronix, PK, Cage Nephilim, and Horseman. If you're interested in supporting this podcast for as little as $2 per month, please check out patreon.com/bondiesel, ko-fi.com/bondiesel, become a member on YouTube, or subscribe over on Twitch. Getting into the gaming news. In the PlayStation segment, we have a little bit more about the Insomniac hack. I believe last week when I talked about this, it had just happened, and there wasn't too much info out. I believe the main thing I said is that there was Wolverine screenshots. Well, it's a lot more than that, unfortunately. Even referring to this at this point as a leak or whatever is just not appropriate, honestly, is what it's come down to. So let me clarify how I'm going to talk about this. Talking about the actual gameplay that's released, or the things that have released that show gameplay, I'm not going to do that. I'm obviously not going to talk about any of the personal info that was put out. Of this kind of thing, in some of the documents, there's talk of Sony potentially needing, with their first party studios, needing to do staff reductions and even plans to shut down a studio. That stuff's probably, it's so unsubstantiated at this point because none of that has happened. That, like all of the things that were leaked, it's subject to change. And I really think that stuff should all be looked at with heavy skepticism. Anything future, wise should be looked at with heavy skepticism. What I do want to talk about is, and I think this is within the boundaries that's fair, and when I proposed this, no one pushed back on me, is talking about their roadmap for the games that were going to come out, or are going to come out, as well as some info that came out about the sales numbers and dev costs and things like that. Especially the financials, I think, are worthy of talking about, because I think it can lead to a bigger conversation about the sustainability of AAA gaming and all of that. So getting to the roadmap, at least at the time, the Insomniac was basically on an every 2-year big release schedule, which they've basically been on since the first Spider-Man, or even Ratchet and Clank, really. I guess it was Spider-Man, then Ratchet. And so this Wolverine game, which a lot of people were speculating was going to come out in 2024, or I think we're kind of hoping it would come out in 2024, because it kind of looks like PlayStation, who already had a pretty meek 2023, is going to have maybe even an even more meek 2024, at least from the first parties. Wolverine looks like it was always meant to come in 25. And then Spider-Man 3 in 27, and then a supposed X-Men game in 29, with a few more beyond that, but even these are kind of weird to talk about. Obviously, the Wolverine game is going to happen. Double, obviously, the Spider-Man 3 game is going to happen. Everything beyond that, you start looking at 27, 29, you're talking about the next gen of consoles. If there's potential for Xbox to have their next console in 26, then you're looking at probably 27 or 28 for the PlayStation 6, and that's when you're getting into the conversation about these games. I suspect these are still going to be realistic time frames. I'm curious, and I would almost need a dev to talk about how such a substantial leak could impact the future of Wolverine, at least. Supposedly, There may be some Spider-Man 3 stuff out there. Again, I don't really want to get into talking about that stuff specifically, but I suspect it's a bruise, it's a bruised eye. All these devs and designers and stuff don't want people to see this stuff before it's done. That's why even like accidental leaks, like what happened with Xbox or other hacks and leaks that have happened, that's the biggest annoyance about it. And why, like a publisher like Ubisoft, who just habitually leaks their stuff, it sucks because they lose control of the message, right? Seeing stuff before we're supposed to see it is bad enough, or is the worst case scenario, because people don't realize that a lot of games are getting worked on till the very end. My best example, or maybe it's a terrible example, is how Anthem they weren't even sure they were going to have flight in Anthem 6 months before it came out. Now, obviously Anthem is a bad example because of all of the other reasons, but I don't think that was a unique issue to Anthem. Maybe a mechanic that significant to the game being decided that late, that probably is unique, and it's probably a symptom of the other issues of that game and of BioWare at that time. But it's just an example for me of, these games can be drastically different right up to the time they get released. So when you're talking about seeing footage or seeing things from a game that could be from 2021 or 2022 or even this year, for a game that wasn't expected to come out for 2 more years, I mean, you're talking about, literal vertical slices or completely experimental things that they're doing, because, for a lot of games, we only ever end up seeing a minority of the work they did on those games. They do so many, bits of exploration and experimentation and all of that you can't take this stuff too seriously. So this sucks. I think the roadmap is interesting. It's the funny thing is the roadmap was the least surprising thing I think that came out of all of this. Insomniac, while I would say that their games, I think that they're maybe a hair overrated. The speed at which they get their games out and how good they are despite that speed is wild. And I think this cadence they were going for seems less realistic as time goes on, because games seem to only be getting more complicated to make, but is something that I actually wouldn't be surprised if they don't deviate much from. Now, part of the conversation that I think is more interesting to have is about some of the financials that came out. And there was a little bit of misinterpretation stuff on this. The most interesting thing I saw was that all of their big mainline games had development costs that are basically, especially in the future, everything basically from here on out is expected to be over $300 million to make, which is insane. Like that's over $250 million. Like, it's so much money. And that gets you thinking about, like, oh my God, like, Grand Theft Auto 6 is probably going to be a game that, if you include marketing and everything, is probably going to be around, like, I don't know, $1 billion, and it'll make it back, but like, ugh. And one of the interesting things was that Ratchet and Clank, in this story, even as someone like me who's more of an Xbox fan and is always happy to find a reason to dunk on PlayStation, this one got a little out of control. So Ratchet and Clank was a relatively cheap game for them to make. I was actually surprised about how little they spent to develop it. And it looks like it basically broke even. The initial numbers showed that it may have lost money. Revised or some new information has made it seem like it actually probably made money. It probably didn't make much, but it made some money. My push on that people I haven't seen discuss is that Ratchet and Clank wasn't really probably meant to be a big blockbuster game. It was literally a launch title, I believe, for the PlayStation 5. It was a game that they needed to be there for those early adopters to have something to show off this new tech. Now, all of the claims they made about how the portals worked and stuff like that in that game have been like a little debunked about like that it had to be PS5. That game could have been on PS4. They could have at least made it work. So regardless, even as someone who tends to lean more towards the Xbox side and be happy to be kind of a fanboy against PlayStation, the numbers of Ratchet and Clank aren't bad for PlayStation, in my opinion. If anything, it breaking even was an example of like, hey, we made this game basically so people had something to play that was a PS5 exclusive, and enough people bought it that it paid for itself. That's fine. Especially when the same company is making games like the Spider-Man games that are making hilarious amounts of profit. So it's like, not that big of a story. But the whole idea of all these upcoming games that they have listed, the projected costs for them, and that's before delays or other issues, all being over $300 million, is something that you should be thinking about just as a game fan, especially if you are a fan of these big AAA, big publisher studios. And that, like, that's not probably sustainable. You're talking about games that are going to have to sell 7, 8, maybe 9 or 10 million copies to just be worth making. And that isn't realistic for most publishers. Not to mention that we're starting to see indie games even, the indie label is becoming so impossible to really button down. But like, a game like Baldur's Gate 3, we now know that Larian has at least their partial, I think it's 30% ownership from, I believe it was Tencent. And that's, it was probably a financing deal for them to make Baldur's Gate 3, because Baldur's Gate 3 was probably a really expensive game to make. It should be, it looks like it. And it's just kind of looking at the future and wondering, like, how is this sustainable? Obviously the market's growing, and we'll talk about some good stuff for Sony after this about their console. But like, how is this sustainable? Like, obviously you have some of these prestige developers who are pretty much a guarantee to sell 10 million copies every single time, right? But like, that's not for everybody. And you have games like a game like Immortals of Avium that was published by EA from a indie AAA studio that used them for publishing. And that game probably cost maybe not 300 million, but probably 150, maybe 200 million. And it definitely didn't make its money back. And then you start looking at things like Game Pass and like, how is Xbox going to justify making games that cost $300 million? Their model of really focusing on Game Pass and things like that, for developers, it can probably work out, because the way Game Pass typically works, if you put a game on Game Pass as a third party, especially if you make it day one on Game Pass, especially if it's exclusive, Xbox will basically pay for your development. So you're going to see studios, I think, be like, hey, we'll sign up for that. But then it's going to turn around and, Xbox is going to have to be picky about that, right? Like, Xbox is going to have to make sure if they give a company $300 million, that there's going to be a return on that, with people getting Game Pass and purchasing games and buying consoles or buying hardware or whatever. So like, obviously this hack is awful. The fact that it involved essentially a ransom and stuff, and obviously Sony didn't pay it, so all the info came out. The fact that people's personal information has been leaked and exposed, and I've already seen stories about people having to lock down their bank accounts and their credit cards, change their phone numbers, do all kinds of stuff that is directly because of this hack. That sucks. Anyone who's spreading that info is the worst. Even the gameplay stuff, I've basically tried to ignore, even though I probably won't play these games, or maybe I will if I have a PlayStation by then. Even that sucks, because like I said before, I really hate seeing devs lose the messaging. I think once a game is released and it's out in the wild, then we're all, let's jump on it and dogpile or whatever, we want to do. But doing it like this and seeing weirdo, like, even as someone who considers myself an Xbox fan, seeing like all this, like the worst part of social media, at least for gaming, where you have all these douchebags who are like hyper console warriors on any of the sides, especially PlayStation and Xbox. And you see these like weirdo Xbox people being like, "This game looks terrible." I'm talking about Wolverine and the leaked footage, like trying to be like, "Oh, this game looks like one." I don't know. I won't talk about it specifically, but like it's stupid. You think of your favorite game. If you looked at it, if you got to see what it looked like a year before it came out, let alone 2 years or 3 years before it came out, it wouldn't be good, right? Let's take a look at Red Dead Redemption 2. 3 years before it came out, I bet it didn't quite look like what I think is a masterpiece that it ended up being. So, I think the biggest thing to take away from everything that we've seen, or at least that I'm willing to talk about, is that I think we're going to continue to see the Rockstars and the Sony first party devs and probably Xbox first party devs continue to make these like crazy expensive games. But I think we're also going to see that those publishers, at least Xbox and Sony, are going to have to also be willing to do their hi-fi rushes, their Pentiments, their maybe 20, 15, $20 million games, or even 50 to $100 million games, which seems small nowadays. I think we're going to see more of those, even if it's just to hopefully help pay for the other ones, or really to be the gap fillers, because not only are some of these big giant AAA experiences going to be, so expensive, these are games that are taking 5, 6, 7 years to make. And so if you have a studio that they can only make one game at a time and they're spending this much money and it's taking them 4 or 5 years to make this game, we're even seeing it with Xbox. Even when a publisher has 30 studios, it doesn't mean, even then they're struggling to get out more than a couple big experiences a year, let alone hoping to get one out, every other month or every quarter. And that's only going to get worse, and it's only going to get more expensive. Meanwhile, we have all these layoffs and all that stuff as well. So it's a weird thing. I really think we're going to see probably a pretty big adjustment in the gaming industry in the next, probably 5 years, where, we'll always have these big experiences, but I think they're going to become fewer and further between as we start to see games maybe dial it back a little bit. People hate it, and even I do, but on one hand you've got like engines like Unreal Engine 5 trying to do a bunch of stuff to streamline dev, which is really great, but you're gonna see a bunch of these publishers and studios start trying to make things like AI generation and all that. It's a way to speed it up, whether it's assets, whether it's voice dialogue, whether it's writing. And I think we're going to see that increase. I think we're going to see a lot of people push back on it, and it will probably not be the meta in the future, but you're going to see it. And eventually it's going to get good enough that you may not even be able to tell very easily, but we'll have to wait and see. So Insomniac hack, the parts of it I'm willing to talk about, mixed bag, right? But something interesting to cover anyways. And some better news for Sony, they announced that they have sold 50 million plus consoles of the PS5 generation. Surprisingly, that's actually slightly behind the PS4 sales. There's obvious explanations for that. The first couple years that the console's been released, it was COVID times, which you would think would mean more sales. But as everyone probably remembers, all of the reductions of supply and things like that, supply constraints, and this even shipping, getting consoles over here after they were built, that obviously slowed it down. That will recover. I have no doubt in my mind that PlayStation 5 will end up probably selling more than PS4. And it may, you can argue about why. But the simple fact is that from the days of the PS4, the game industry and the consumer base is just bigger now. Now, is the console base bigger, or the people who are willing to buy consoles with how popular mobile gaming is and stuff like that? That's a bigger question, but it seems like it probably is bigger, in that it wouldn't surprise me at all if relatively quickly we see the PS5 sales surpass the PS4 kind of curve. What does this mean for the other consoles? As we all know, Nintendo just doesn't really care. They just do their own thing. In Xbox, I know this is the big one that everyone focuses on, and they talk about how Xbox is only selling one console for every 2 or 3 that PlayStation sells. I think I talked about it before, but people really need to start realizing that all 3 of the major platforms are going 3 different directions with their business plan. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's more or less successful, but I just don't think Xbox cares that much if they're not selling as many consoles. Don't get me wrong, they would love to be selling more consoles than PlayStation, but I think the fact that they aren't, isn't a thing that they are, losing sleep over. I'm sure Phil would love to be selling more consoles than PlayStation, but I think people are not realizing that we've got these 3 platforms that are technically competitors and are competitors for sure, are just looking different directions with where they're going and who they're really competing with. And so that's going to be another thing I think in the next 5 to 10 years. It's going to be really interesting to see if one of them prevails and the other 2 start chasing them, or if they all continue to kind of, get further away from each other as competitors while we kind of move this industry forward. Speaking of Xbox, Bobby Kotick has announced that he is leaving Activision Blizzard King on January 29th. This was long expected. I believe it had even been mentioned before that he was leaving. I could tell there was always this kind of like nervous fear amongst, the Xbox folks and just people in the game industry in general, that like, there was always this kind of like, Kotick's going to be gone, right? Like he's definitely going to leave. Like, right? Like, I still think there was some anxiety amongst people of being like, is he really going to go? Like surely he's going to leave, right? And he has. Or he will be here in about a week. He'll be done at ABK. I find it very unlikely he's gone for good. I very, very much suspect he will pop up somewhere else. He could end up at an Embracer. He could end up at another, a Tencent or something like that. I even think it is very possible he ends up over at Sony. That would not surprise me even one itty bitty tiny bit. But more than likely, I suspect he'll take the hilarious amount of money he's getting as he leaves, and that he's gotten for many years, and maybe even just tries to do his own thing. We'll see how that goes. There were lots of other staffing changes as well, lots of high up positions in ABK, people, vacating those positions to, find new opportunities, or I suspect it's a big part of it where they know they're about to have new leadership and ownership. A lot of the people in the power positions they're in at ABK will no longer be answering to Kotick, or will no longer be answering to no one. They'll be answering to someone at Xbox. And I suspect that either on their side or on Xbox's side, there's been conversations of, yeah, we would like to, change some things up here. There's a lot of hope that Xbox will kind of change the culture at ABK and try to make things a little better for the people who work there under all of those studios. But we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. There was an early bit of good news where I believe it was 80 QA devs who are unionized and worked for a contracted ABK studio have been made full-time employees. As it seems like one of the early Xbox moves. This is, for sure, probably just for good PR and to try to smooth over this transition. Hopefully Microsoft sticks with being friendly to these unions and doing all of that stuff and not pulling some of the stuff that Kotick pulled and that Activision was kind of known for, amongst other awful things. And hopefully this is a sunny day for ABK devs and other folks at those studios. The Lies of P director talked about the Game Pass benefits and was basically really glowing about it. I only mention this because there is, fairly often chit chat about how, third-party studios hate being a part of Game Pass and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that's true. I think that depending on the type of game. Now, when we hear about like Baldur's Gate 3 won't be on Game Pass. Well, obviously not. They have many, many, many full price copies to sell. That they don't need Game Pass yet. I still hold very strongly to that. We will see Baldur's Gate 3 on Game Pass one day, but that won't be until it makes financial sense for Baldur's Gate 3 for Larian, and as long as there's still enough demand that it makes sense for Game Pass as well. So this Lies of P thing, not surprising, but I thought that was a good example for a multi-platform game that was on the Xbox Game Pass. I'm a great example of someone who would have never, ever, ever purchased that game, but I downloaded it, I played it for a while. It wasn't really my thing, but I left with a really good outlook on it. And, it definitely makes me say, when another game comes out and they say from the people who made Lies of P, I'll be like, oh yeah, that game was really cool. Maybe it wasn't my thing, but maybe the next thing is, so I suspect that we'll see plenty of those stories moving forward. The last thing I'll talk about with Xbox is actually some of my own content. I made a video, it was essentially called Starfield is a Good Game. And I regret that. I'm not going to take it down because it's gotten lots of views. The whole point of making the video was to put out some content for people who do like Starfield to find and hear at least some, friendly words from, it's unfortunately I went a slightly clickbaity route in the first 5 seconds of the video. And unfortunately it seems like that led to people listening to the first 5 seconds, pausing, making very mean comments, and then not watching the rest of the video. That there was lots of talk in the comments of that video about how Starfield is actually a bad game, and I'm a shill, because they pretty obviously didn't listen further into the video for me to recognize all the things I know are wrong with the game and to completely understand why, the people who don't like it, and not faulting them at all for that. But still, backing up my man, I'm still backing up this game that I really, really do enjoy. And I think was so good. And a big part of the video I talk about is how I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, believe that purely by luck, the way I played Starfield and the missions I did and the order I did them and the things I didn't do before I finished the game initially, or at least completed the main quest line, I think I think I got a very ideal experience of Starfield where I didn't play some of the weaker parts of the game or experience them until after I had kind of finished the main quest, and how that really impacted, I believe, because when I see other people talk about it, I can definitely tell they had different experiences, right? Like one person in particular, and if this is you, I'm not dogging on you, I'm just making your example, a few times has mentioned to me that, yeah, I played almost 300 hours, but didn't finish the main quest line, which is like crazy because it's not really that long. And then they, talked about how they spent so much of that time trying to 100% explore all of the random planets, which in my opinion is the worst part of the game. Now, I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum. If someone was enjoying doing that, that's really cool. But for me, it's like kind of hard to hear someone say, actually, I think Starfield kind of sucks. Even though I played 300 hours and even though I spent at least I assume a really big chunk of that, doing what would be arguably the worst part of the game, and then not even fulfilling what I would argue is the best part of the game, and some of the narrative and some of those experiences and stuff. And so, yeah, I made that video. I've probably been a little too active in the comments. My biggest thing is that I'm a hypocrite. I'm never going to deny that. I'm a bit sensitive at times. I can be a little passive aggressive. All of those things are true, and all of those things are expressed in those comments and my replies. At the end of the day, though, like I'm going to defend myself, and especially if I see people being silly, I'm either just going to mute them from the channel, which they'll never be heard from again, or I'm going to reply and defend myself. And expect that with all of my videos. And my content isn't for everyone. That's probably why there's a relatively small number of people who consume it, and that's okay with me. This isn't my job. This is something I do for fun, and I will try to learn and be better. But I also am gonna be authentic and do what I think and say what I think is real for me. So go check out that video and try not to be too mad at me. I didn't have any big Nintendo headlines this week to talk about. As for other gaming topics, EA announces a new Frostbite logo and a vision for the Frostbite engine. This article was interesting. So we know that there's at least some studios who have been kind of dabbling with other engines. We're under the impression that the next Mass Effect game will be Unreal Engine 5. I believe the Motive game, the Iron Man Motive game, is Unreal Engine 5 as well. While we also know that the upcoming Dragon Age Dreadwolf from BioWare is still on Frostbite. If you don't know, Frostbite is a pretty old engine at this point, even though it's been like significantly iterated on over the years. It was originally made by DICE and still is managed by them, and was meant for the Battlefield series, which it is extremely good at. It's really good at making big multiplayer shooter games with vehicles and destruction and all of that. What it doesn't seem so good at is, some of the other stuff that we've seen examples like in Mass Effect Andromeda and some other games where, it just didn't seem like maybe it was the right engine for that job. I will say that a game as recently as Dead Space, jeez, my brain locked up. The Dead Space remake that just came out is on Frostbite, and it looks really, really good. And all of the faults I remember from like Andromeda and stuff were, at least I didn't notice them. I thought it looked really, really good. It's actually what makes me pretty hopeful for Dreadwolf from BioWare, as well as some other games. I suspect Frostbite has matured and gotten to a point where it's more usable for these studios who are making these non-Battlefield games. If you don't know, I believe even the modern like FIFAs or the FC soccer game, Madden, all of their sports titles are all in Frostbite as well, I believe. And this makes sense, just so you know, like you consolidate for two reasons. One, it's cheaper to have your own engine, and two, you get that shared experience. One of the big strengths of Unreal Engine is that there's hundreds and thousands of people using Unreal Engine. There's people making assets. There's people learning how to use it for certain types of games, and it's kind of a community project. So when the developer, even the big AAA dev, has problems with Unreal Engine, or if they're trying to figure out a solution to something they're trying to do, someone's probably tried to do it before, or someone else is probably also trying to do it. Now, I don't know how much interaction there is between big AAA devs, but at the very least, it's just, there's so many people using Unreal that a lot of the issues are getting worked out kind of organically. Where, with Frostbite, if only DICE was using that engine for Battlefield only, that would be one thing. But if, most of the studios under EA are all using Frostbite, for better or worse, they start to create their own little network doing that. You're also seeing this happen over at Ubisoft. It seems like Ubisoft Massive's Snowdrop engine, not to be confused with Frostbite, which I do all the time, is becoming kind of ubiquitous too. It seems we know that there's multiple studios who already have or are currently working on games for the Snowdrop engine, as their previous engines, like the Anvil Next engine, which I think like Far Cry and the Ghost Recon series have been on. I think Assassin's Creed as well, as that's starting to go away, because I believe some of those franchises are moving over to Snowdrop. So it's interesting. I'm curious to what the future of Frostbite is. I think it's obviously going to keep being developed for the Battlefield games, probably the sports games as well. But it is telling, I think, that EA is starting to allow some of these studios, BioWare specifically, to start to dabble back into Unreal Engine, which, if you don't know, Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3 were on Unreal Engine 3, I believe. So they skipped Unreal Engine 4. Even though, if you don't know, the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, I believe, used some components from Mass Effect 4 to do like some of the auto upscaling and all that. I don't know. Look up people who actually know what they're talking about for that info. We have news about Team Kaiju. It was shut down by Tencent. This was a studio founded by former 343, the Halo studio, Scott Warner. And this comes along with a story I saw about how China is doing a bunch of changes to some of its media policies and laws, and that's caused Tencent's value to drop like 10 or 15% as of the last time I looked at that information. So that's probably a story to keep an eye on, because I believe Tencent is the leading game publisher in the world, just because of all of their investments, and there's a slight possibility that may go away for them. And it's going to be interesting to see how some of the changes over there in China affect Tencent, who has become quite a power player in the industry, even though it's often as a silent partner. Embracer supposedly has secured funding through 2025. Embracer has probably been one of the worst offenders of layoffs this year, with shutting down studios, shutting down projects, laying people off, because they basically acquired a bunch of studios, like big studios and really big IP, and just have done nothing with them, and don't release any games. And the games they release are often bad. And they had originally, I believe earlier this year, tried to secure funding from the initiative that Saudi Arabia has, which has its own set of issues. But apparently through their previous funding source, they were able to secure funding through 2025. If you don't know why this is a big deal, it's because, especially when interest rates are low, a lot of these big publishers don't really have the cash on hand to pay all of their employees, and so they often will take very nice or very friendly financing deals to finance basically their pay to run all of their operations. And when that deal fell through with the Saudi Arabian fund, and they were running out of their own funding, and they're not making any money. Embracer, they've hardly released any games this year, despite having a huge catalog of studios. They were in trouble, and that's why they were cutting down operations so much. So hopefully them achieving funding through what I assume is through the end of 2024 will help stop that bleeding a bit. But they're going to have to put out some games, and they're going to have to make some money so that they don't have to completely depend on this, or else, late 2024, 2025, we're going to be looking at Embracer, shutting down these studios, or selling them off, or selling off IP, or whatever they're going to have to do. I still don't think Embracer is long for this world, and I don't really care about that. What I am terrified for are these dozens of studios and their IP that are just going to be hanging in the wind if Embracer, kicks the bucket. So we will be keeping an eye on that. The Sea of Stars devs have announced that I think they've already implemented a patch that will remove a NPC in the game that was supposed to be Gerard, or the Completionist. If you haven't kept up with that story, basically Gerard, or the Completionist, is a pretty prominent YouTuber and game personality who for the last 10-ish years has run his own charity with his family that was in commemoration of their mother who died from a specific disorder that they were raising this money for. They had raised over $500,000 over the years, told people repeatedly that they were using that money to donate to funding and research on attacking the issue that befell his mother, mentioning it a lot and really pushing that hard as recently as a couple months ago, only for everyone to find out through these kind of shady YouTubers, but they knew their stuff, that all of the money for the last 10 years that's been collected has never been donated to anyone. It's just been sitting there. There's still questions about various fundraisers and money from those fundraisers that don't seem to be included in that $600,000 that's sitting there, from golf fundraisers they've done and stuff like that, as well as Twitch streams and all of that. The videos came out talking about what happened, about finding this money just sitting there. Eventually Gerard responded in kind of an aggressive way and a very non-apology type of way. Then the people who initially broke the story came out with more info, which I assume they were holding on to in case he did come out and not just apologize and then do the right thing. And then he's been silent ever since. If you know who SkillUp is, he's a pretty prominent game reviewer. He has a podcast called the Friends Per Second podcast with Lucy James and Jake Baldino, of various other game websites and such. And they cut Gerard. He was their fourth, and as of now, they're just three of them. So he's lost that. I assume he has stopped, making any videos on his channel, and that he's probably in recovery mode, and he probably won't ever recover from this. What's interesting, and I'll kind of give my own aside to this, on that Friends Per Second podcast, Jake and Lucy and Ralph, who's SkillUp's name, would often talk about like, oh, this new game that was coming out next week, or that just came out, and how they reviewed it, and they'd be talking about it. And almost every time Gerard would be like, oh, I didn't get an early code for that, and I haven't played it yet. And that was his contribution to like 90% of the topics. And so it kind of seems like he didn't have a lot of connections before the controversy. I can't imagine he's going to have more after. I'm not here to kick anyone when they're down. But at the same time, this kind of seems like the finding out part of the effing around, I guess, is what all the kids say nowadays. So that sucks for that guy. The final story is a bit of a bummer, but I don't want it to be. It should be a celebration. James McCaffrey, who is the voice of Max Payne in those games, and Alex Casey in Alan Wake 2, as well as being an actor and a performer in his own right, passed away at the age of 65 after a battle with cancer here in this last week. I've played all of the Max Payne games, and I really like them. I've really, really enjoyed Alan Wake 2, as I'm still trying to finish it up. And, James McCaffrey's voice was just so iconic and so unique. And so, like, if you heard his voice, you knew who he had voiced, right? It was, very, just very unique to him. And, I've lost my own, family to cancer and things like that. And that's really hard. And even, gosh, almost 20 years later at this point, it still, gets me. So when I see these stories, obviously we lost a great performer in the gaming industry, and someone who meant a lot to a lot of gamers, but we also, someone lost a son, someone lost a husband or a parent or a friend in James. And that sucks. Cancer's the worst. So thoughts out to his family and everyone who knew him well. And I guess a small consolation is his talent and his, just a little bit of his personality will be forever remembered in the form of the characters he played, forever, which is really cool. Moving on to listener questions. If you have any of your own questions, be sure to ask in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on Twitter over at @BonDiesel or @the Baunfire. This week I have a topic from Jernsum over on Blue Sky. Which games do you have lined up for the holidays? For me, it will be Kerbal Space Program 2, which he notes has been patched up and is working much better now than before. City Skylines 2, which I imagine is in the same boat, and some of The Division. For me, those sound great. That sounds like a lot of fun. For me, it's going to be probably maybe a little Division 2. I've really been playing a lot of Squad lately. It's a milsim type game, which I actually really enjoy. Escape from Tarkov is going to have their wipe probably here in the next couple days, where, for the last couple years, I've been trying to get that magic back and get really into Tarkov. So we'll see if this update will do it for me. As well as I did start a new Baldur's Gate 3 playthrough, and I'm still trying to finish my human-centric Mass Effect playthrough from March. This is the longest it's ever taken me to do a playthrough on Mass Effect, and it's because I kind of lost my love for it. But I am trying to finish that up because I have my PC modded Mass Effect all modded up with a bunch of new mods, a bunch of new things I want to check out. And so while I'm not that excited to finish my human-centric playthrough because it just kind of, I just haven't enjoyed it that much, I'm really excited to start a new Mass Effect playthrough, which I'll be doing on stream quite a bit. So that's what I'll be doing, as well as maybe trying to dive a little bit into some backlog that I've very, very much ignored this year, for better or worse. So really great question. Like I said, if you have your own or a topic you want me to cover or get at, or if you just have some feedback that you want me to respond to on the show, make sure to hit me up literally anywhere. I am happy to get your feedback anywhere, basically. And that's where we're going to wrap this up. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Let me know if you have any feedback or thoughts about the show. I am always happy to hear them to try to improve things. One of my big goals for 2024 is to at least double the audience of this show. So help me out with that if you can. You can find me all over the internet as Bon Diesel. You can catch me specifically for the podcast at the Baunfire over on Twitter, as well as the other social media accounts that I'm still working on, trying to get all of those going. If you want to support my content, please check out patreon.com/BonDiesel. Join as a YouTube member, subscribe over at Twitch, or check out my merch and my other links in the link in the description below. That is all I have. So until next time.